This is an ABC News special report.
Good afternoon, I'm Tom Yamas with some breaking news out of the White House, a stunning development inside the Oval Office. We've just learned that Stephen Bannon, the chief strategist for President Trump, has resigned. Now, Bannon was a controversial figure from the get-go. He had been with President Trump for a year, first joining him on the campaign as the chief executive. Before that, he was a conservative media provocateur. But many people credit Steve Bannon with shaping President Trump's message of populism, America first, and nationalism. He was no doubt controversial from the moment he entered the campaign, partly because of his work with Breitbart, the far-right conservative news brand that many people have called racist in the past. Steve Bannon himself has also been quoted as saying Breitbart was a platform for the alt-right, a white supremacist movement. Now, this information that we've just received from ABC News, once again, that Steve Bannon has resigned. This resignation happened 2 weeks ago. It was effective on Monday, so he essentially has been out of the White House for the last 4 days. I want to get to our senior White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, who's been tracking these developments for the last couple of days now. Cecilia, can you walk us into what exactly happened and how this decision took place?
Well, it's not unexpected, Tom, but here's what I can tell you. This seems to just now be reverberating around the White House, even though a lot of people perhaps knew that this was coming. Steve Bannon has been on the ropes in this White House before. He has survived rumors that he was out in months past. He's got 9 lives, if you will, inside this administration. But the fact that this came down today, or that rather we learned about this today, really caught a number of people that I've been talking to inside the administration by surprise. They didn't know that this was going to be the day that this would happen. I think if I were to say sort of the straw, if you will, that broke the camel's back really was this interview that Steve Bannon did within the last couple of days with a magazine where it's our understanding he called this reporter and unloaded and contradicted the president on issues like North Korea and made claims saying that, claims about a white nationalist movement that calling them crazies and fools, if you will. This is a president who does not like to see people speaking out of school in his administration, among others who he has battled with in this White House. Steve Bannon has battled with in this White House, not just angering the president, but really has had a knife in his back from many inside the West Wing in recent months, from Jared Kushner to Gary Cohn to others. And this has been a long time coming, Tom.
And by all accounts, a fighter up until the end, whether in front of the camera or behind the scenes. I want to get back to that article you were mentioning. It's from the American Prospect, a progressive publication. And this is the quote. And this is from Steve Bannon, again, the chief strategist, who at one point sat on the National Security Council for President Trump. He said, until somebody solves the part of the equation that shows me that 10 million people in Seoul don't die in the first 30 minutes from conventional weapons, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no military solution here. They got us. That had to drive the president crazy, Cecilia.
Yeah, that, Tom, compounded with a number of things. I mean, from as simple as SNL, profiling Steve Bannon as the mastermind behind this White House, and magazine articles and magazine covers showing Steve Bannon's face on the cover, saying that he was the mastermind behind this presidency. And let's just go back to that exceptionally controversial press conference that President Trump gave a couple of days ago, where he was under fire for the things that he said about Charleston. Buried in that, were his comments about where he stood on Steve Bannon. He was asked whether he has confidence in his chief, in his strategic counselor, this right-hand man in the West Wing, and he wouldn't say outright. He said, I like Steve Bannon. He said that he goes, I don't believe that Steve Bannon is a racist, but he wouldn't say whether he'd had confidence in Steve Bannon. And that is where this is a president that will not move forward, I think, with someone in his camp with whom he has lost confidence. And again, I've got to reiterate, it wasn't just the president himself. It's our understanding that a number of people in this West Wing were angry with Steve Bannon and had lost confidence in him, Tom.
Cecilia, stand by. I just want to kind of lay out some of the major resignations in less than a month. Sean Spicer resigns as press secretary. Reince Priebus resigns as chief of staff. And Anthony Scaramucci resigns as White House communications director. And now we've learned chief strategist Steve Bannon is also out. I want to bring in our chief anchor, George Stephanopoulos, somebody who has worked in the West Wing and who has covered President Trump in depth. George, I have to ask you, I mean, this is incredibly a critical time for the president right now. He's having problems abroad and here at home, and now his chief strategist, many will say the person who shaped his message to help him win that campaign, is gone.
Right, and it's a message that's been hurting the president for the last week in the wake of his remarks over the demonstrations at Charlottesville, his failure to condemn the KKK and neo-Nazis early on. It made it untenable, along with everything else, for Steve Bannon to stay in this job. And I think the last straw had to be that interview he gave the other day to the American Prospect, where he undermined the president's position on North Korea, where he took aim at allies of the White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and the National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. But Steve Bannon had been a man with a lot of enemies inside the White House for quite some time, starting with Jared Kushner. The president himself was not happy with the attention that Steve Bannon was getting, and Steve Bannon was losing a lot of arguments inside the White House as well. He'd been pushed out of the National Security Council. Some of his key allies on the National Security Council had been pushed out as well. The question now for the president is, what is he going to reconstitute his staff under John Kelly, and is he going to be willing to follow their direction?
George, talk to us about the machinations of the West Wing right now at this point, because you're essentially running an Oval Office, an administration with a brand new chief of staff, a communications director who's been put in place but who doesn't have a whole lot of experience in politics and is just there in the interim. And now you have your chief strategist, the man many people credit for tapping in to those votes, to those voters who were overlooked, has left, the Oval Office, has left the West Wing. What happens now?
And you've got a president at the top. Don't forget, this all begins at the top in the Oval Office. President at the top who seems relatively unwilling to take any direction from anybody at this point. And you also have, when you look at the other senior members on the staff who've survived, Gary Cohn, the chair of the National Economic Council, reported to be furious with the president's comments over Charlottesville. You've got Jared Kushner and Ivanka Kushner also still playing key roles inside the White House. One of the things we're going to find out is how willing they are to accede to the direction of John Kelly, the new chief of staff, as well. But in some ways, this is a White House staff being built. Look at the litany of resignations you just laid out, being built from the bottom up. But the big question is still going to be, is the president himself willing to change the way he does business, willing to change the way he communicates, and is he able to fashion a coherent agenda? At the same time, while he's dealing with all this turmoil in the West Wing, he's also alienating the allies he's going to need in Congress, starting with the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, other key senators like Lindsey Graham, Jeff Flake, Tim Scott of South Carolina, at a time where in order to get anything done inside the Senate, he can't afford to lose more than 2 votes. He's alienating key members of Congress, key senators every single day.
But, George, on that point, every politician's first goal, the first day in office, is to get reelected. Steve Bannon is the person who helped him get elected. He tapped into those Trump voters that many people and a lot of critics of the mainstream media even forgot. Steve Bannon somehow knew who those voters were. He knew what those voters wanted to hear. Is this going to now hurt the president with his own base?
No question. I mean, you're right about the influence that Steve Bannon had, even though the president chafed at the idea that this was Steve Bannon, not President Trump himself, who was making this appeal. But right now, the president has actually the opposite problem. He is down to his core supporters right now. He's at somewhere around 35% approval rating now. His strong approval rating among Republicans has been dropping. He's holding on to that very hardcore populist base that Steve Bannon identified. But in order to be a successful president, he's got to start figuring out how to reach out beyond that base, how to reach out to regular rank-and-file Republicans, how to reach out to independents and Democrats, how to secure majorities in the Congress. Steve Bannon was not helping with that effort at all. He was alienating members of Congress, even as he was securing the base. He was alienating others in the West Wing in pursuit of his ideology, and that was hurting the president.
Chief Anchor George Stephanopoulos. George, thank you. I want to go to Matt Dowd right now, someone else who has advised presidents in the White House and on the campaign trail. Matt, if you had to advise President Trump right now, with his chief strategist now gone, what would you tell him?
Well, he's created a White House that we know from day one has been in chaos. It's sort of how he ran his campaign. He obviously was successful in his campaign, but a White House can't be in chaos. I think this is the worst blow so far of his presidency, coming at the tail end of probably his worst week as president. And as George said, he's in his lowest approval numbers at this point. I don't know what he can do other than try to sort of stand back and re-examine himself and cause himself to have some self-reflection. The problem ultimately for President Trump isn't Steve Bannon, wasn't Anthony Scaramucci, wasn't Mike Flynn. We forgot that Mike Flynn and this FBI director, long before these recent firings, they were fired. And I think he has to have some self-reflection. The question is, does he have the capacity to have self-reflection?
Matt Dowd for us. Matt, thanks so much. So again, we're following breaking news out of the White House. If you're just tuning in, Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, one of the men who helped President Trump win the election, has resigned. According to ABC News, we've learned he resigned 2 weeks ago. This resignation was effective on Monday. We're going to stay on top of this story throughout the afternoon. We'll have a full update on World News Tonight with David Muir. We now return to our scheduled programming.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Hey guys, Amna Nawaz here live in New York. Continuing coverage of breaking news today, another shakeup in the White House. President Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, has resigned effective earlier this week. We understand he handed in his resignation 2 weeks ago. But for the man who shaped much of Mr. Trump's presidential campaign and much of his administration, this is a huge, huge change there in the White House. Joining me in Washington, D.C., my colleague Mary Alice Parks, keeping an eye on things down there. And Mary Alice, we cannot underestimate the influence Mr. Bannon had, not only on getting Mr. Trump elected, but on shaping his presidency over the last few months.
But that was a fact that the president himself tried to distance himself from. Remember that press conference over the weekend when he was at, maybe it was Tuesday, I'm losing track of days. He was asked earlier a few days ago that what role Steve Bannon played, what his role would continue to be in the White House. And he seemed to sort of downplay the role that Bannon had. He said, oh, we did a lot in the campaign before he came on board. We know this is a president that does not like to share the limelight. He does not like when there starts to be headlines about someone besides himself at the White House. And he tried to downplay the effect and the role that Steve Bannon had on his campaign. But those of us that covered the campaign remember him coming on and really rocket launching the campaign out of the convention and able to get a whole new sort of swath of voters on board. Steve Bannon was media savvy, he was election savvy, and he was really credited at the time with Trump's success.
And let's go live now to our colleague, senior White House correspondent Cecilia Vega. Cecilia, Fridays seem to be something of a new tradition in the White House now. We've got Sean Spicer resigning on Friday the 21st, Reince Priebus being fired on Friday, July 28th. And now, of course, Friday, August 18th, we're just learning about the the resignation of Mr. Bannon. But tell me the backstory here. Why are we learning about this now when his resignation was handed in 2 weeks ago?
Well, it's a great question. I was just speaking with one source as we were reporting this out, and even sources inside the White House had no idea that this had happened or was coming today. But the source said, hey, it's Friday firing day. So even people inside the White House expect there to be an axe dropped on Fridays now. Look, in some ways, this is no surprise. The day itself, that it happened today, I think has caught a few people off guard, caught us off guard, definitely. But everybody knew that this was coming. White House watchers, people inside the White House. Steve Bannon has had 9 lives inside this White House. He has been on the fence for weeks now. He has been on the fence before. We, have reported that Steve Bannon would be leaving imminently, and he has managed to stay in the president's inner circle. But now it seems that this is actually a done deal. To me, the question that I've got going forward is whether that he resigned or whether he was fired. Perhaps it's a combination of both. We know that there were people inside the West Wing who were livid by that recent article, that magazine interview that Steve Bannon gave to the American Prospect magazine, where he contradicted the president on North Korea, really just rebuking what the president had said about laying down the law there with fire and fury. And that did not go over well. And of course, this is a president who does not like his staffers to get out front in terms of publicity, in terms of messaging. And Steve Bannon had managed to succeed in doing that.
Well, Cecilia, the palace intrigue is one part of this, right? But where the rubber meets the road is the actual influence the core team around Mr. Trump, President Trump, has on him and the policy they push forward. There was a divide, right? An ideological divide between the kinds of things that Mr. Bannon saw as priorities and the kinds of things that, say, Jared Kushner and others saw. So does this mean that one side is winning over the other?
Well, this is exactly the reason that the palace intrigue matters in covering the Trump White House, because, yes, there were knives out for Steve Bannon, and he has had knives out for others. And the question is, who does the president listen to in the end? Today, it seems that he has listened to the other side, those Jared Kushners, the Gary Cohns in this administration who wanted Steve Bannon out and have had wanted him out for a long time to come. But let's not forget that this Steve Bannon nationalist message, this extremely controversial message that taps into what some would say are very ugly elements and components of our country, has propelled the president to the White House in many ways. So this is the reason he got elected, for this message of being outside a Washington outsider. And so it remains to be seen whether this is a president who will listen to those who remain in his inner circle right now, and whether he can succeed at perhaps winning over those in Congress that he needs to win over right now, with Steve Bannon gone. He was among, if not the most controversial people in this West Wing, a block in many ways to this president getting an agenda pushed forward. And now that he's out, we'll see what happens.
All right, that is our senior White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega. Thanks, Cecilia. Good to talk. Back now to Mary Alice Parks in Washington, D.C. Mary Alice, we shouldn't mince words here. I mean, Mr. Bannon was responsible for Breitbart, which he bragged was basically a platform for the so-called alt-right, which among its audience and people who self-identify includes racists, white nationalists, white supremacists, and others. What do we know about any continuing influence Mr. Bannon could have on this White House or on President Trump?
Right, he can continue to influence this White House if he goes back to Breitbart or continues to work with media organizations sort of in that sphere. And it was his previous work at Breitbart that had a lot of Republicans here in D.C., some real top Republican leadership, very leery about him joining the White House team from the beginning. I remember on Capitol Hill, all reporters bringing questions to Speaker Ryan from day one of this administration. How are you going to work with this White House and Steve Bannon when his publication has repeatedly labeled you the enemy? Steve Bannon and Breitbart repeatedly went after that core sort of Republican establishment, as they would call it, Republican leadership, campaigned partly against them. And, and I think it's really interesting, that conversation, too, you were having with Cecilia about does this move mean that these other factions in the White House are winning the day? And I see that with him resigning. But on the other hand, when you look at the president's comments just yesterday, those tweets that he wrote that were so racially charged, using language that really echoed some of that nativist rhetoric that we've seen from white nationalists over the weekend. He talked about white culture being attacked. He had a tweet at the end of the day about going after Muslims. I mean, it's hard to see how that Bannon-esque voice hasn't been winning the day this week.
Let's go now to our colleague Matt Dowd, ABC's chief political analyst, who's joining us on the phone. And Matt, we're talking a lot about this palace intrigue, about the constant turmoil within the administration. But do you read Mr. Bannon's departure as something more significant?
Well, good to be with you, Amna. As you remember, I said earlier in the week on Good Morning America, I said Steve Bannon's interview in The Spectator reminded me of the guy that turns over his desk, throws his computer out the window, and cusses out his boss right before he's about to get fired. That's what it reminded me of. And I think this is the biggest blow so far of Donald Trump's presidency, which says a lot because he's had a lot. I mean, he's got a White House in chaos. It's incredibly dysfunctional. You would have to say objectively this has been his worst week of his presidency. He's at his lowest point in approval ratings of his polls, but also of any president at this point in time. And now he's losing basically what people used to refer to at Karl Rove as Bush's brain. This is basically Trump's brain. He sort of mended together all of the disparate parts of this strategically and sort of had an overall idea about what they wanted to do. And so I think this puts it even more in chaos, what's going on. This isn't going to solve any problem, in my view. Ultimately, what President Trump did this week in his words and his actions and how he responded to Charlottesville, how he's acted in the White House, he owns those. And so I just think it adds to the disarray, but I would have to say, as I said, it's the biggest blow so far of a White House that has been in disarray since day one.
But Matt, here's the other part of this, and Mary Alice, feel free to jump in here. You know, we're talking about sort of the effect that Mr. Bannon had on President Trump, on the policies that he's introduced. I mean, this is a man who did almost a 180, President Trump that is, after the introduction of Mr. Bannon into his campaign. In an interview with Breitbart when he was a candidate, he talked about desirable immigrants, the kind of people you would want to bring into the states, and that there he was just a few weeks ago reviving the RAISE Act, which basically slashes legal immigration in devastating ways to America and the economy. And that's a clear effect that Mr. Bannon had on Trump and the administration. So is that going away?
Is that to Mary Alice or to me?
To you, Matt. Why don't you take it first? And Mary Alice, feel free to jump in.
Sure. None of this is going away. I mean, when we look at all of this, and if somebody came to me and said, okay, what can you do to fix this? Ultimately, they're not going to be able to fix all of these things that they've created. They're a White House that is purely about 1/3 of the country, and Bannon, interestingly, represented that part of that third. So this is actually the first time that the president has now pulled the plug on part of the link to that 1/3, but he's not expanding at all to the 2/3 of America that have real questions about his presidency and what he's doing and all that, on a variety of issues, including immigration and all of the response to white supremacy and all of those things. And so I think, if the president could take a moment of contemplation and self-reflection, which I don't know is possible, we haven't seen it at all in his life that he could do that, maybe he should stay over at Camp David by himself and sort of take some time of self-reflection and realize that all of the roads of the problems lead back to him.
And I would add his unwillingness to grow, foster, try to build any bridges. What we've seen time and time again is when something goes wrong for this president, he goes to his tight inner circle. And that inner circle is just shrinking every single day. There's no effort, like Matt was saying, there's no effort for reflection, but there's also just no effort to reach out or seek advice or counsel. I think that has been so evident this past week. And now with another one of his strategists gone, I am not sure who, if anyone, he is listening to.
Well, I just want to talk about Mr. Bannon for a second here, too, because it's, just his removal from the administration doesn't mean this is the last we're going to hear from him. This is not a man who was doing this for the money or for the prestige or anything. He has a clear political and nationalist agenda, and he basically goes back to another significant platform. Breitbart is still there. He still has a means through which he can get his message out. Did this year with President Trump basically just embolden Mr. Bannon and the people who identify with him and that message, that nationalist message that he's been wanting to push out? Matt, what do you think about that?
Well, there's a great famous saying that says, don't ever get in a fight with somebody that buys ink by the barrel, right? And so I would add to it, don't ever get in a fight with somebody that has an incredible social media platform. And Steve Bannon has a social media platform. What we don't know at this point, since it's just happened, is what's the relationship like between Donald Trump and Steve Bannon. Donald Trump has been known to maintain linkages with people that he quote-unquote fired or people that left it over time. So we don't know exactly what Steve Bannon's tack would be, though I would guess that having only served 7 months of a presidency and leaving in the midst of incredible disarray, Steve Bannon, who is very protective of his own brand and has been very protective of his own brand in his history, his adult history, is probably going to go out of his way and make sure that brand is preserved. And he has a ready place for that, which is Breitbart.
Mary Alice, how do you think that we're going to continue to see, or whether we'll see, if Mr. Bannon influences things moving forward?
Like I was saying, if the president feels like he is running out of people to call and he wants to seek any counsel, I can see him continuing to reach out. One interesting theory is whether or not this was in some way sort of a public sacrifice from Steve Bannon. That idea has already been floated, will surely be floated. We saw just headline after headline of Republicans rebuking this president, people calling it the worst week of this presidency. Was this a way for Steve Bannon to in any way divert attention off of the president, to somehow give him a small win by rejecting that part? Steve Bannon is so media savvy. I don't think that we should at this point so early on throw away any possibility for why he might have done this, what his calculations were, and what he is still hoping to gain, or how he might be still hoping to influence this president down the road.
I mean, he's media savvy, and yet at the same time, he's incredibly inflammatory in some ways. I want to bring in our colleague Mary Bruce down in Washington as well. And Mary, you know, one of the things we've been talking about is sort of the impact of someone like Mr. Bannon on the messaging and any influence on the administration. He gave all these recent interviews, and in one, he talked about race identity politics, right? Saying the race identity politics of the left wants to say it's all racist. Give me more, tear down more statues, say the revolution is coming. I can't get enough of it.
Suggesting that would actually be beneficial for this administration. Look, this is part of the reason why Steve Bannon is so controversial, and part of the reason that perhaps that interview may have been the final nail in the coffin here for Steve Bannon. Remember, he has been this voice of defiant populism. He's a relentless nationalist. That is a voice that has not sat well with some within the president's own White House. It's a voice that has not sat well with a lot of establishment Republicans, certainly up on Capitol Hill, where I spend much of my time these days. And going forward, the question is what comes next? First of all, what voice will Steve Bannon play on the outside of this administration? There's actually been a lot of speculation that perhaps one of the reasons he's lasted so long is because there was concern about the role that he may play if he does leave this administration, and whether that would possibly hurt or help the White House. That remains to be seen. But also, what will happen now in terms of the president's relationship with Congress, as we were just discussing, because Steve Bannon has not helped what is already a very fraught relationship between this administration and Capitol Hill. Right now, that relationship is pretty much on the rocks, especially after the president's recent comments this week. And Bannon was one of those people who encouraged the president to take on the swamp, to take on some Republican leaders. He had some very not nice things to say reportedly about Paul Ryan in the past, when he was the leader of Breitbart. Breitbart went after Paul Ryan many times. So it will be interesting to see how the establishment Republicans and also the far right up on Capitol Hill responds to this resignation.
And Matt Dowd, we know that Steve Bannon had, among his detractors in the White House, he had supporters and very strong relationships there as well. His relationship with the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, goes back quite a ways. He has Stephen Miller still in the administration. Do you think that we're going to see changes among those staff members in the administration moving forward?
Well, if the past is any prediction, yes, we will. I think you'll probably see Sebastian Gorka is going to be next. I think he's been in battles with the other senior people at the White House, and he's been linked to Steve Bannon. I think he will go soon. After, I don't know about Stephen Miller. If I were a person in the White House now, I would seek to keep my head way down and stay out of any conversations on anything. But I think you're going to see. I think you're going to see by the time Congress really gets going in the fall, there'll be a White House that is going to be totally turned over. It already is partially, but I think more people will go. And I think some unrelated to this directly with Donald Trump will leave of their own volition because the chaos is just too much.
All right, Matt Dowd joining us on the phone. Thanks, Matt. Good to talk.
Thank you too, Amna. Thank you.
Mary, I want to get your take on this one theory that potentially Mr. Bannon was the sacrificial lamb in the aftermath of the train wreck that was the president's responses, I should say, to Charlottesville. And the idea that because of the pressure from Republican leaders in Congress, someone had to go. What do you make of that?
Everyone is trying to unpack, right, still the president's response here. And in many ways, yes, I think a lot of people pointed to Steve Bannon, wondering if he was the architect behind the president's decision to come out and initially blame many sides, then take 48 hours to clarify and call out the hate groups by name, and then that explosive press conference on Tuesday. Many people thought that maybe Steve Bannon could have been, the voice behind that. And so it would make sense that if someone had to go, if they were looking for a firing, that they would look to target him. But look, the president's relationship with Bannon has been up and down a roller coaster since the very beginning. Since, of course, we saw Steve Bannon out on the cover of many prominent magazines, that Time magazine cover. We know from covering this president very closely, that he does not like it when members of his staff seem to suck up more oxygen than him. That is not something that sits well with President Trump. And when Bannon was coming out and getting all of this praise for being sort of the mastermind behind the Trump administration, the puppet master, if you will, that is something that sort of got him on the outs in the White House. So this is not just a relationship that has been fraught in recent weeks. It has been up and down for months. But it does seem, or certainly given the timing, it seems that perhaps the president's response to the violence in Charlottesville, what we know about Steve Bannon's history, his prominent voice as that relentless nationalist, that perhaps that all came together and was just simply too much for Steve Bannon to survive.
Mary Alice, the one name we haven't mentioned yet is that of General John Kelly, the chief of staff. And it strikes me that a lot of speculation abound that perhaps General Kelly had something to do with this as well, that when he came in, he was supposed to be all about keeping the administration on rails and adding professionalism to a place where that hadn't been prevalent before. Do we think he played a hand in this, and could this be a signal that maybe things do start to get weeded out in the administration?
I think that's absolutely part of the perception here, that John Kelly needed to rein in a chaotic scene and was at odds with Steve Bannon. But also remember the other crisis before Charlottesville was North Korea. And you had Steve Bannon this week saying that he didn't think there were any good military options in North Korea, really sort of defiantly putting aside what the generals had been saying, sort of as if he was the biggest, smartest authority on the topic, really ruffled a lot of feathers with those interviews he gave. And so I can't imagine that went over well with someone like Kelly. We have seen the generals in many ways come in and stand between the president and anyone else. And then you have Steve Bannon insulting members of the military in some ways, sort of saying he doesn't believe anything that they're bringing to the table. I mean, that had to have played a part in this too. Did John Kelly want Steve Bannon's voice around at all if they have to go back to the North Korea question soon?
All right. Well, another Friday, another major White House shakeup behind us. Mary Alice Parks and Mary Bruce, thanks for joining me. Thanks to all of you for watching as well. Remember, you can go to abcnews.com at any time for continuing coverage on the latest on this story and others. For now, I'm Amna Nawaz, and I'll see you back here soon.